Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of my Cedar Point Recreation Park. We are still hard at work building some ride stations, but for today's episode I wanted to go back to Gemini where we were just recently and do a couple more tweaks on it. I was inspired by some great comments I got on the last Gemini episode with some interesting tweaks I could make to the ride to make it look a little bit more realistic. So the first thing we did here is actually change the train type, which was not something I was expecting I would be doing today. Previously, we'd been using the wooden coaster trains, standard wooden ones, but I got a fantastic suggestion from QDude24 in the comments to change them to hyper coaster cars instead. It's a very subtle difference, but I think it actually works really well. And it makes sense too when you consider that this is an aero coaster that was built not too long before Magnum, and the train types are really the same thing. It may look like a wooden coaster, but Gemini really is just a hypercoaster. It's a racing hypercoaster with wooden supports. So I think this winds up looking a lot more realistic compared to the wooden coaster trains, especially the coloration. The designs with the yellow and white accents on the sides looks a little bit more subtle, like the real thing. And I like that a lot. So thank you very much for the suggestion. And things like this are why I always ask people for suggestions at the end of every video, because there's always going to be little things like this that other people are going to think of, and I never would have thought of something like this. But it really is a nice little touch to this coaster. I'm also experimenting here with a different track type. I talked about that a little bit last time. We had started off with the wooden coaster track for our original track build, and then switched to the hybrid coaster. But neither of those things looked particularly realistic. And one suggestion I got was to use the hypercoaster track, like I mentioned a minute ago, and then add my own custom wooden supports. And that's because the hypercoaster track is of course based off of the aero builds. It's not a perfect match. Gemini's track doesn't have a center spine on it, like you get on the coaster track here. I've tried to mask this by making the spine brown and the rails gray, so it kind of looks like you just have gray rails and wooden supports for them. Again, it's not perfect, but I do think this does look better than the hybrid. The hybrid was a bit too bulky as far as the rails went, and I think this is a little bit more subtle and looks a little bit more realistic. So I think this is the design we're going to stick with. The main problem here, of course, is the custom supports, especially when it comes to things like sidewalls and rails like you get with the wooden coaster and hybrid coaster. I tried to put in a couple little bits like that here. Didn't spend too much time on it. I think we'll have to come back here at some point and clean some of that up. That is going to be pretty time consuming to get something that looks good, and I didn't want to spend all day on it, especially if I'm not super satisfied with how it's looking. So that's going to be another future thing we'll come back to if I feel like it's necessary. But after all this is said and done, I feel like I'm finally satisfied with the way Gemini looks. I know we've spent a lot of time here lately, but hopefully all this effort is worth it. Moving along today, decided to finally give due to one of the last major rides to build in the park, and that is Thunder Canyon, which has been sitting neglected over here in the corner between Maverick and Millennium Force for a very long time. As I mentioned, I've been putting this one off because it's a little bit low on the priority list. It doesn't really affect the layout of the park a whole lot, so I didn't need to build it right away. And it's also really hard to find good photos of the layout of the ride itself and how it looks. Especially since on Google Maps it's covered in trees, so it's almost impossible to tell what it's doing. However, since I have since discovered the CP Insiders website, as I have mentioned in a previous episode, and it had lots of good photographs that I was able to combine with a couple of POV videos on YouTube and Google Maps to put together a pretty good approximation of what the ride is doing. As always, this isn't perfect. One thing that makes this a little bit complicated is that the ride itself in real life is on a very gradual downward slope, which is really hard to approximate with the River Rapids ride here in RCT. So I just threw in a couple of gentle drops to try to approximate it. It looks a little bit janky. You can really tell where the water elevation changes, and I'm not a huge fan of the way it looks. But I think when we cover it up with enough trees and decoration, it'll be a little bit harder to notice that kind of thing. This is definitely one of those rides that benefits greatly from having a lot of decoration around it. Spent a lot of time working on the station itself. It's been a very long time since I've ridden one of these rides in real life. I know I have, it's just been a very long time, and I don't think I've ever ridden Thunder Canyon specifically. You don't see a lot of rides like this built in RCT to be realistic, especially with the big turntable style station that it has. It's a very cool feature. I know other River Rapids rides have something similar. But it's nice that it's the kind of thing that looks really good in RCT. You just throw down some wooden track as a big platform, and I think it looks pretty nice. One other fun thing I'm doing here is using mini golf track for walkways. The entrance and exit for Thunder Canyon is a very narrow walkway that goes over top of the river rapids. And I felt like mini golf was a good choice for it because it's pretty narrow and it doesn't cover up the track as much as the regular path would. It's a fun little detail, and I think it'll look a lot nicer once we actually get some peeps back here. Currently, none of Frontier Town is accessible by peeps, since there aren't a whole lot of rides back here and we haven't gotten to the stations for Millennium Force or Maverick yet. Those will come soon enough. I would like to get some peeps on Thunder Canyon, as I'm really liking the way it's looking so far. But as I keep saying, you throw enough trees on something and it's bound to look pretty decent. And this ride is definitely not an exception. There's a few details here that I'm not totally confident on. For example, the little waterfalls that splash the guests as they go past. That water comes from somewhere up top, and it's impossible to tell what that looks like. You can't see it in videos or photos or with the Google satellite view. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to do for those. I just have some extra track placed up top, and it looks a little bit weird, but I feel like you have to show the water coming from somewhere. Imagine it's pumped up from the main water area, but not really sure what that looks like if you actually went up and looked at it. But anyway, that's a small detail. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with how things are looking over here. When we come back and do some more decoration around Frontier Town, this area is going to look even nicer, and I'm looking forward to getting that done. But as for now, I think that's about all I wanted to go over today. Making some pretty good progress, of course. And I'm pretty happy with the way things are turning out. Still a long ways to go as usual. Just got to keep cranking away at it, and we'll get there eventually. Hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, if you've got any comments, questions, suggestions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.